All right. Thank you all. We're excited to talk about these South Dakota suffragists. There were certainly thousands of people involved in the suffrage movement in South Dakota, so we've narrowed it down to 6 of the more active, but we couldn't narrow it down to 1. So here are our 6 highlights, women to know and remember for the future. The first woman I'm going to talk about is Emma Smith DeVoe. And the key takeaways are that she was a very active organizer. She was a very active and well-respected speaker. And she sang at many of her campaign events. She was active from 1889 to 1891. That was the first state amendment campaign for a suffrage ballot measure, was the election of 1890. And she moved out of state in 1891, but came back and participated in the 1916 campaign as a guest speaker as well. So there's an extra year for her. Emma Smith was born in Illinois in 1848, had a fairly, good education as a young woman in the Midwest, but became the head of the Department of Music at Eureka College in Illinois as quite a young woman. She did marry Civil War veteran John DeVoe in 1879, and they moved to Huron in 1881. And they homesteaded in Huron, proved up on that, got another homestead in Fauquier County, and when the railroad built through and skipped where they wanted to have a town and instead went to Fauquier, they sold up and moved back to Huron. In 1889, she was involved with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the organization working to limit the sale of alcohol in the state and across the country. And they had a department that was focused on franchise, because one of their strategies was that if women were supportive of temperance, if they could then vote, they would vote for temperance. So the WCTU worked for suffrage. And she was a speaker at some of their conventions when Felina Johnson of Highmore spotted her, recognized her talent as a speaker, and encouraged her to continue on. In October 1889, she was put in charge of Women's Day at the Beadle County Fair. And so we weren't a state yet, so there wasn't a state fair, but Huron was already had its sights on being the state capital, so their Beadle County Fair was a big deal. And she organized speakers to appear in what they called Floral Hall, which I assume was a tent on the fairgrounds. And many of those spoke about suffrage, especially Helen Barker, who was the president of the territorial WCTU. DeVoe opened the program. Barker was the primary speaker, made a, quote, grand plea for enfranchisement. And then after the fair, the DeVoes, John and Emma, hosted a meeting at their house to organize a suffrage club and prepare to have the first state suffrage convention that fall. And statehood came in November, so they were a little ahead of the game, but they knew what was coming, so they set that up. They did ultimately hold the convention in Huron at the City Hall, and they formed the South Dakota Equal Suffrage Association. The DeVoe House continued to be the headquarters, quote unquote, for the campaign to come, and it was known as a haven of rest. John DeVoe was also an active suffragist, and he designed the state association's emblem that was used on their letterhead, medals, and pins with justice and equality on the scales and the ESA at the top. For the state association, she became their state lecturer. So it wasn't an office on the board, but she was the one in charge of going out in the field and raising the troops. She spoke for almost the entire year, not constantly, but at stretches, and different from the national speakers who were often speaking at railroad stops. They were here for short periods of time. They wanted to hit the most amount of people. She went and she'd focus on a county for a week. She'd stay there, sometimes speaking twice a day, having meetings, speeches at schools and churches, and then they would wrap the week with a convention at the county seat and organize a county association to continue the work. So she was in a lot of local rural places, meeting people and talking with them all. The one clipping is from when she appeared in Beresford shortly before the election. So some of those little bits of advertising are part of the University of South Dakota's collections. So I'm glad they have those there. Her biographer is Jennifer Ross Naval, and has said that her speaking was in a particularly feminine style. And there were comments in the press comparing her to the national speakers, who they sometimes found aggressive. And they said that Emma Smith DeVoe, she was speaking as one of them. She had a sort of anecdotal and collegial style, a little bit teasing at some points. And there were points in the press that got brought up, like the quote there, that she said, apparently, "When I meet a man that is prejudiced, I think there's no use arguing with him, and I offer a silent prayer to the Lord to have mercy, not only on his soul, but on his everlasting thick skull." So you can see she was a smart speaker, knew her audience, knew her state, even though she'd only been there less than 10 years. She traveled extensively. There were press clippings in Sully County. She apparently traveled 166 miles by wagon team, which people found of note. When she went to the Black Hills, that trip required lengthy stage rides over the rough country, and she sometimes spoke twice a day before she got to a spot where she could stay the night. But she also, when they reported on what she said, she was saying smart things, talking about the rights of women and wanting to be involved in politics. But a lot of the suffragists of the time also positioned themselves in opposition to people they considered other sections of society that also weren't allowed to vote. And they often brought up that we, as intelligent white women, don't want to be associated with them. How could you treat us like you treat them? And in this quote in particular, those others included idiots, lunatics, criminals, Indians, minors, and, quote, illiterate and ignorant freedmen and aliens. So it was a wide swath, but that was the mentality and one of the arguments they used to try to get fellow white men to vote for them. Her campaign, she did use music. John DeVoe was a musician in the military and a songwriter. He wrote, the big one that they used was called A Soldier's Tribute to Woman, and he dedicated it to the Women's Relief Corps, which was the Auxiliary Veterans Association, that her husband wrote, sent her out. She would sing the song at the events and then pass out copies of the music so it could be perpetuated by the clubs. And it's very evocative lyrics, the one up there. Then I swore to help the women, for their hearts were loyal too, and my vote shall go to free them, for they nursed and brought me through. And it was all about his experience in the war and the sort of the duty they owed to the women who supported the war effort. And he wrote multiple songs, and when the state association published their little songbook, it was sort of pocket-sized. It included some lyrics and several songs by DeVoe, as well as some of the songs that were circulating nationally. And the state office had their headquarters in Huron, and they sold copies for a dime. When it came to the summer, there was a leadership crisis, and a lot of the officers of the state association turned over, and there was fighting between state people and national people. But when they came through, they wanted to hit and get major political party support. And so they targeted the state Republican convention that was being held in Mitchell. So they had their convention in the couple days prior to that, and then they tried to appear at the Republican convention. They weren't allowed to be on the program, the platform, but they were given time to speak during one of the recesses. And apparently, part of her quotes is one of the strongest quotes I've come across in suffrage research. The times are as revolutionary now as they were in 1776, and if the cause for which our forefathers fought was just, then is our cause of equal suffrage in South Dakota just, and if our cause is not just, then the very foundation of the republic is false, and the structure reared thereon should fall to the ground, dishonored and disgraced, which is strong words. They were also quite upset at not being allowed to be on the official program. So I don't know how much that played in, but you can tell her skill as an orator if that quote is accurate to what she actually said. They also appeared at the state fair, she was in charge of Women's Day again and had a similar setup with speakers. They brought a parade from downtown. The fair was in Aberdeen that year. They had a parade from downtown to the fairgrounds, set up in the grandstand, a bigger space, bigger audience, and they had the national speakers, Susan B. Anthony, Olympia Brown, Anna Howard Shaw, all these people that had been in South Dakota campaigning. They gathered them together to speak at the state fair. But the vote failed at ballot in 1890, and Emma DeVoe had a little bit of activity. She wrote an open letter from the state association that appeared in the newspapers, trying to mitigate the reasons why they lost, and encouraging people to continue to work for their, quote, holy cause. She also went to the National Convention in Washington, D.C. in 1891, early, I think, January, and also said some interesting things that covered a wide variety. She talked about the injustice that women weren't allowed to serve on juries. She thought that new immigrants being able to vote on their first papers was unjust as well. And at that election, there had been a parallel vote about the enfranchisement of Native men. And so the suffragists were upset that that had gotten more favorable response than their bill. So she had some racist things to say in response to that event as well. But in 1891, they moved to Illinois, and she stayed involved and became a national speaker, touring extensively in the 1890s. You can see all those Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Montana, Idaho, and Nevada. And then they moved to Washington, and she ended up heading their suffrage campaign and leading it to victory, quote unquote, in 1910. And their house in Tacoma was preserved and is on the National Register of Historic Places, which I just learned within the last month, and I was kind of excited. So maybe I'll have to make a pilgrimage at some point. But after they received suffrage, she set up an organization called the National Council of Women Voters, wanting to keep women politically involved. And after ultimately the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, that organization joined the National Suffrage Association to become the League of Women Voters. So had a national impact beyond her career in South Dakota. But she did come back for the 1916 campaign. And like she did in 1890, she was out on the road in the small towns, and they did a flying squadron type campaign where there's sort of small group of national speakers would hit a town. They'd have a meeting with the local women. They'd have a street rally, standing up in an automobile, shouting at whoever was coming home from work, to then go to the theater and listen to the main lecture rally, political rally. And they went all around the state. One of them broke a rib because the roads were rough, and they were in an automobile that hit a pothole, broke a rib. And when they started, Emma joined them in Deadwood, and she went to Mabel Rewman's house, which we'll hear more about. And Mabel had a reception for them because Mabel Rewman had worked for DeVoe in Washington. So connections all across. It was a small state even then. And I just wanted to highlight, like I mentioned, Ross Naval has a biography of Emma DeVoe, if you're interested in more, and wrote an article for our State Historical Society Press Quarterly, and that's available online, so you can find that for free. Okay. Lydia Johnson is my next person. She was state president for the 1910 campaign, was a speaker and a writer. She was born in Sweden. We have surprisingly few immigrants in the suffrage movement, but she was one. Immigrated at age 15 to Washington, married Julius Johnson, who was a lawyer, and they moved to Fort Pierre. She was involved in the Federation of Women's Clubs and had a statewide platform there before she got into suffrage fully. But it came after quite a contentious 1909 lobbying effort. The temperance people and the suffrage people had finally started to realize that the temperance people had serious enemies, and if the suffragists were going to win, they wanted to dissociate themselves from temperance and the liquor lobby that was going to try to crush everything. So they tried to split. It ended up on the ballot, but kind of by accident. They had a convention in Aberdeen, elected Lydia Johnson president of the state association, and she hit the campaign trail, not only organizing local clubs, but also making appeals to the State Bar Association, the Congregational Churches statewide group, lots of different organizations to try to broaden the support for the amendment. They went to the big events, the state fair again. By this time, or shortly, there'd be a women's building at the state fair, so there was a bigger presence. And then they went from the state fair to the Corn Palace Festival in Mitchell and had a booth and passed out literature there as well. She often spoke about legal issues. She had worked with her husband in his office, worked on his political campaigns, spoke about married women might not bring issues to court if they risk losing their children, and they might not talk about the abuse that they were suffering or try to get redress for that. And if they took it to court, they'd face a male judge, male jury, laws created by men for men. And she wrote and spoke often about that. Cicely Tinsley was the headquarters secretary in Sioux Falls, and there was another leadership crisis in 1910. She ultimately resigned. Johnson had to help cover until they hired someone new. But I loved that there's a photograph of Tinsley in the Sioux Falls office that's part of the Carrie Chapman Cat collection at Bryn Mawr University. So I had to have that photo in here. And the Federation of Women's Clubs turned down an endorsement of suffrage that year. And Anna Howard Shaw was the national president and was speaking through the state, and she was upset. In the press, she would say lovely things about how well the campaign was going, but she lived with Lucy Anthony, and the letters back to Lucy are part of the collection at Harvard. And in her letters back to Lucy, she said things like, "Thank heaven there's only 13 days. These women deserve to lose. They mismanaged this campaign to such an extent that I wish I hadn't come." So you get to hear what she actually thought. Vote failed in 1910 as well. Johnson organized the state meeting, and it sort of got reorganized. Mamie Pyle took over the leadership, and we'll hear more about her. But it reorganized as the Universal Franchise League, ultimately. And Johnson just really wanted the cadre of women in Sioux Falls that she'd fought with to be sort of out of the picture. And that was her aim, apparently, for this convention. After the 1910 campaign, she went to law school, got a law degree from the University of South Dakota, had to take her daughter with her while she was in school, or decided to take her daughter with her, and then was admitted to the bar in 1912 and went into practice. So she then became a lawyer in her own right. And then for the 1913 campaign, she wrote more on legal issues. There was a state suffrage newspaper that she wrote for. She wrote articles, similar themes to what she'd spoken on before, but that was published out of Pierre by Ruth Hipple. And then in the 1917 campaign, she didn't have a statewide role, but that year they faced the war effort, the influenza epidemic. The suffragists who had been so active in previous campaigns were spread very thin. So one of Johnson's letters mentions that she was doing some of the campaign literature distribution when so many other women were having to nurse their family and neighbors. So a little bit of an interesting intersection with the influenza epidemic. And she wrote to Pyle when they finally won about how glorious it was. And Pyle recognized that Johnson and others, there'd been a generations of leadership in this campaign that built up to it, which I found touching. And later she continued on in politics. Her big claim to fame was that she became the Huron County state's attorney, and was the first state's attorney who was a woman in South Dakota. But she ran for office multiple times, had roles in the National Association of Women Lawyers and the South Dakota State's Attorneys Association, and had quite a long and distinguished career after her suffrage work. And I wanted to give credit to all the archives where all this wonderful research came from.
Hello, I'm happy to be here to tell you about two persevering suffragists who bookend the women's suffrage movement here in South Dakota. Nettie Crabb Hall worked as a foot soldier in the 1890 campaign. It was the first of 6 campaigns to change the amendment in South Dakota so that women could vote equal to men. Mamie Shields Pyle led the final campaign to victory in 1918. I will first explore the life stories of both women because I think their backgrounds really inform who they became and why the issue of suffrage was important to them. Then I'll discuss their roles in the 1890 and 1918 campaigns and how they persevered against difficult conditions and stiff opposition to their cause. The two women shared many characteristics, but they differed in significant ways. They were both educated, taught school while still teenagers. They became mothers and then widows. As widows, they were property owners and taxpayers. And today I did the calculation and found out they were both almost exactly 50 years old during these campaigns I'm talking about. They differed by generations and eras. Nettie Crabb Hall came of age in the Civil War era, and Mamie Shields Pyle came of age during the Progressive era. They had different careers, motivations, and their experience in public advocacy was different, and those I will all bring up as I go along in this talk. Ann Zonetta Crabb, called Nettie, was born in 1841 in Indiana and overcame many sorrows in her early life. First, her mother died. Then her father died when she was 12. Her only 2 sisters died young, leaving her just with a stepmother and a stepbrother. At age 18, she married a physician, Dr. Robert Weems, who died in a sanitarium when she was age 37, and 4 years later, her only child, a son, died of typhoid fever. I would say that 4 years later. Prior to the death of her husband and son, the family moved to Minneapolis, where they fostered her husband's infant nephew. It appears that the mother died in childbirth, and this is where she would begin earning her own living. Hall's changing career choices indicate a woman becoming more and more comfortable working as an equal in a man's world. She started as a school teacher before marriage, taught music in Minneapolis, sold milliner supplies and homesteaded in western Minnesota. While she also, as a homesteader, you would call her a farmer. When she moved to Wessington Springs, Dakota Territory in 1882 to homestead again, she also advertised her services as a physician, likely without a medical degree or probably even any formal training. And I did check the newspaper reports, and she did work as a physician because they would write in the paper about the little boy whose leg she fixed, whose broken leg, or somebody else who didn't die because of her help. So she really did practice as a doctor. Hall later purchased a pharmacy and was elected vice president of the State Pharmaceutical Association in 1894. During her time in Dakota Territory, she married Cleveland Hall, a wounded Civil War soldier, veteran, I should say, who died 3 years later. Hall also adopted an orphan from Ohio during this time. Hall felt passionately about the issue of temperance, speaking, writing, and organizing throughout the state. She was active and held leadership roles in both local and state Women's Christian Temperance Union organizations. She traveled throughout the state promoting better hygiene in homes as the WCTU's state superintendent of hygiene. She was active politically, winning an election as a school director in 1887, before statehood and before women achieved full suffrage. Hall also served as an election judge, likely being the first, or at least one of the first, women in the territory elected to these two positions. Hall's life was filled with sorrow, but that seemed to only make her stronger and more resilient as she spoke and wrote and advocated for issues that mattered to her. One of those issues was equality with men, and that required the right to vote. As an active member of the state suffrage organization, Hall worked as an organizer for the 1890 campaign, and after that campaign, she continued to travel wildly and advocate for national prohibition. In 1895, during an economic downturn in the state, Hall moved to Fitzgerald, Georgia, where she worked as a reporter and then purchased the local newspaper. Hall died in 1908 at the age of 67. Well respected in that community, a public fountain was erected in her honor shortly after her death. In an era where women were expected to stay in the private sphere, Hall made herself quite well known in the public sphere, setting an example for other women to follow. Mary Shields, called Mamie, was born in 1866 in New Jersey, but the family soon settled in Minnesota. She grew up an educated woman living a typical, middle-class, comfortable life, moving with her family to Dakota Territory as a teenager. She taught rural school in Brookings County and then later at the city school in Miller. There she met her future husband, a young lawyer named John Pyle. She was 20 when they married. Soon after, they moved to Huron, where she gave birth to 4 children in 5 years. Very supportive of education, Pyle and her husband helped found Huron College. During the populist era, her husband served as the state's attorney general. Pyle's life changed abruptly when her husband died of typhoid fever in 1902, and she was left to raise her family, now ages 9 to 14. 8 years later, when her children were grown, she assumed leadership of the South Dakota Suffrage movement. As such, she ran the amendment campaigns of 1914, 1916, and finally succeeding in 1918. After the passage of women's suffrage, Pyle helped start the state's League of Women Voters organization, serving as its first president. She also worked for the passage of the 1923 Equal Rights Amendment and stayed active in local civic organization. She died in 1949, aged 83. Pyle's efforts at women's equality opened doors for many women, including her daughter Gladys, the first female legislator in South Dakota. Both women were highly motivated to achieve equal voting rights, but that motivation came from different sources. Nettie Hall spoke and wrote ardently about the evils of alcohol. During her time in Minneapolis, she and her son were active with the Good Templars, an early temperance group welcoming both men and women as members. Hall organized entertaining programs and helped start a free city library. Many of these free city libraries were started by temperance advocates as a place for young people to go to keep them out of the saloons. Many of the early suffragists and their leaders came from the temperance movement, as they recognized that the best way to use their voices to change public policy was through the vote. We can deduce that the issue of temperance motivated Hall to fight for suffrage, based on her active involvement in the Good Templars, her leadership in the South Dakota Women's Christian Temperance Union, and reports of her speaking throughout South Dakota and also in Nebraska about the need for prohibition laws. What made this issue so personal for her is yet to be discovered. In addition to her crusade against drinking culture, Hall believed women deserved equality before the law, no doubt influenced by her many roles in the workplace. Pyle, as the wife of a prominent attorney and the mother of 4 young children, did not pursue public causes. But as a widow and property owner, she experienced personally the inequity of voting laws. At that time, South Dakota, along with several other states, allowed non-citizens to vote, as long as they had signed papers indicating they would someday become a citizen. That meant new immigrants could vote without being naturalized. One day, Pyle watched a group of men, not property owners and not yet citizens, being led past her home on their way to the polls. These men were also likely non-English speaking and illiterate. Her daughter recalled, quote, "She stamped her foot. She said, 'If they can vote taxes on me, well, I can vote too,' unquote." Then it became personal, and that was her turning point. In 1909, Pyle and other women from Huron, unhappy with the leadership of the state suffrage organization, basically staged a coup and elected Pyle president 3 months before the 1910 election with suffrage on the ballot. That measure lost. The state organization was dissolved, and in 1912, the suffragists created a new organization called the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, with Pyle as president. Pyle organized her campaigns with the belief that suffrage and temperance should be separated, as entwining those causes created a powerful enemy in the liquor lobby. The time had come to pursue suffrage as an issue of equality. One common characteristic between these two women was how they promoted ethnocentric racism, common in their errors in pursuit of suffrage. Hall expressed herself in very racist language when she encountered situations where Native American voting rights were treated differently than women's voting rights. For example, when suffrage advocates attended a Republican state convention in Mitchell in 1890, some tribal representatives were granted seats on the convention floor, while the suffrage representatives were consigned to seats in the balcony. Hall, a prolific writer, knowing full well the effect of colorful language, expressed her irritation at, quote, "the dusky inhabitants of the wigwam," unquote, being treated with more respect than the women who have been left, quote, "outside the fold," unquote. No doubt her resentment was compounded when the party failed to endorse women's suffrage in their platform. 2 years later, expressing her grievance that South Dakota voters had allowed voting rights for Native American, but not women, Hall wrote about the, quote, "vote by our men people," which made the women people of our state political orphans, but gave the savage all political rights, unquote. As a side note, she's talking about an 1890 amendment written to take away any voting rights Native Americans might have, they really didn't have any, that failed because it was poorly written. In fact, they did not enjoy all political rights. While Hall expressed her prejudice in published letters, Pyle used it as a campaign message. For the 1918 campaign, Pyle's plan was to promote suffrage for women to gain political freedom. But she had to shift the message when the legislature changed the wording on the amendment. In 1918, as I mentioned, South Dakota still allowed non-citizens, men of course, to vote. During World War I, in a state with a large number of German immigrants, people in South Dakota raised concerns about people loyal to the Kaiser, about those people being able to vote, loyal to the Kaiser being able to vote. So amidst this anti-immigrant fervor, the legislature added a citizenship clause to the suffrage amendment requiring voters to be naturalized citizens. Basically, anyone voting to enfranchise women also voted to disenfranchise non-citizens. Those voting no then voted to continue allowing aliens to vote while denying female citizens that vote. This certainly made it difficult to campaign against that amendment. Pyle at first did not favor this added clause, but did agree to shift the League's support to the blended amendment. She recognized the citizenship angle would help turnout. Yet it complicated her messaging, having to promote two ideas as one. She did this by exploiting anti-immigrant sentiment during wartime to elevate the cause of suffrage as an issue of patriotism. By contrasting women's extraordinary loyalty in a time of war to recent immigrants' potential disloyalty, she promoted women as good and loyal citizens who have proven their fitness to vote. There is much to admire about both of these women and their public roles in advocating for suffrage. But these examples show they, along with many of their peers, believed their right to vote superseded other groups. Hall and Pyle played different roles in the amendment campaigns of 1890 and 1918. Hall did some state organizing, but she also worked in the field, traveling to rural communities to persuade voters directly, while Pyle organized and ran her campaigns at the state level. Based on Hall's life story, we know she had boundless energy and was comfortable with public speaking, writing, and travel. In August of 1890, Hall was elected superintendent of election work for the state suffrage organization. She publicized ideas for local campaign activities, including house-to-house canvassing and distributing literature. She was also hired as a lecturer and organized for several counties, including Yankton and Lincoln. This included scheduled stops at schools and churches. In Yankton, heavily populated with German and Russian immigrants, she found some success, but also met with hostility. Once, after riding 7 miles in the rain on horseback, she was turned back and told the meeting had been canceled. You don't ever imagine these, you think about the suffrage women, think, oh yeah, they rode trains and they rode in, you don't think about them as riding horseback for miles to deliver their message and try to win converts. Hall attended the state suffrage convention in Mitchell as one of the state campaign speakers, receiving positive response to her message. And she was part of the committee that attended the Republican State Convention, as mentioned earlier. Near Election Day, Hall encouraged local committees to canvass each vote precinct and hold meetings. She proposed numerous activities for Election Day, prayer meetings before the polls opened, children parading during Election Day with flags, banners, and suffrage songs, serving lunch, putting up mottos at polling places, and holding picnics near the polls. All that work and organizing, though, failed to convince the voters, who rejected the amendment with 66% voting no. Two of Mamie Pyle's strengths were organization and publicity. In 1917, because women were occupied with the war effort, she brought in outside speakers and discontinued prior township organizing, instead keeping a central county committee to schedule those speakers. Unfortunately, disgruntled staff basically stopped working the month before the election. Pyle also worried about a lack of enthusiasm from suffragists who were distracted by their war work, or who had so much confidence in victory they didn't believe they needed to advocate so hard. One of her first actions, as I probably have mentioned and Liz mentioned, was to separate the issue of suffrage from that of temperance. As she had never fought publicly for temperance, she could make her leadership just about suffrage. In 1916 and 1918, she encouraged local leaders to circulate petitions and publish them in local newspapers to demonstrate women's wish to vote. Also in 1918, she put more effort on reaching individual voters through newspapers and direct mail literature, rather than through public speaking events. She analyzed voting patterns to find that the strongest opposition came from German counties with counties with a strong German population. And she worked to send them positive messages. With the passage of state prohibition in 1916, the argument that suffrage meant prohibition went poof, thus eliminating the liquor lobby as a strong and well-funded opponent. In 1918, messaging promoted women as good and loyal citizens, in contrast, as I said before, to immigrants' potential disloyalty. This message resonated with the public, and on Election Day, 63% of the voters approved women's suffrage. Or did they approve getting rid of citizens voting? We really don't know. Nettie Hall fiercely proclaimed her right to equality in a man's world, both through her career choices and her passionate advocacy for temperance and women's suffrage. She constantly reinvented herself as a teacher, wife, farmer, doctor, pharmacist, and newspaper editor. Despite the failure of the 1890 campaign, Hall promoted prohibition and women's rights for the rest of her life. Mamie Pyle led a comfortable life until the tragedy of her husband's death awakened her to the injustice of her inequality before the law. After that, she displayed great skill in organizing and publicizing the need for full women's suffrage throughout several campaigns. In a year with a terrible pandemic, a world war, little money, few volunteers, disgruntled staff, and no ability to hold public events, she succeeded in her cause. And that cause became greater when she helped organize the state's League of Women Voters and supported the 1923 Equal Rights Amendment. Nettie Crabb Hall and Mamie Shields Pyle's stories illustrate how two women's rights advocates persevered in their causes during two different eras.
Well, this is rather exciting, maybe unintentionally. As I've been listening to all of the prior presentations, much of what I get to talk about today in the 1918 campaign, or the last chapter, as Ruth Hipple called it, builds on and connects with many of the stories and personalities already introduced to us in this panel. If you look at our theme today, we're talking about perseverance. We've now heard about campaigns spanning from 1890 to 1918. And I really wanted to kind of both explore the lives of two leaders in 1918, Ruth Hipple and Mabel Rewman, but then also kind of dive a little bit more deeply into that final campaign, as it kind of gives a sense of where the suffrage movement was and kind of the role these women played, and then how it kind of launches where they go after suffrage. So in February of 1918, Ruth Hipple wrote to South Dakota Universal Franchise League President Mary, or Mamie Shields Pyle, whom we just heard about. And in this letter, she kind of encapsulated the feelings of, I think, many South Dakota suffragists by 1918. She stated, "When this war is over and women have the vote, what in the world will we do with our spare time?" It seems to me I shall have the time to do a million things I want to do now and cannot. Similarly, in June of 1918, a little bit further into that final campaign, Mabel Rewman also wrote to Pyle that her hands have been so very full, and between her various commitments, she just hoped to be able to catch her breath. These letters reflect the unique challenges that faced the 1918 women's suffrage campaign, particularly the ways in which suffrage leaders, such as Hipple and Rewman, spread themselves between multiple causes, and as I think Liz said, kind of spread themselves rather thinly in that final year of the campaign. Between suffrage campaigning, war work, and their involvement in other civic organizations, demands on their time and energy were great. However, it was also this varied involvement that helped the 1918 suffrage campaign persevere despite the challenges it faced and find its footing. The perseverance shown by these suffrage leaders also meant that they were not content to kind of rest on the success of 1918, but instead find their next causes. In 1918, as has been mentioned, South Dakota was in its final push for women's suffrage, and neither Hipple nor Rewman were new to the cause. Ruth Hipple, a stenographer at the state capitol, had become the district auditor for the South Dakota Universal Franchise League, or the SDUFL, in 1912, becoming press chairman by 1916, and she maintained that post throughout the 1918 campaign. She had also served as the editor of the SDUFL's weekly newspaper, the South Dakota Messenger, for no compensation between 1913 and 1914. Mabel Rewman had first become involved in women's suffrage actually in Washington State. As Liz had mentioned, she had moved to Washington State to care for an ill sister. In doing so, she herself suffered an ulcer, and she went to a female doctor, and the doctor recommended that the caretaking had kind of worn her down, and she needed to find a cause that she could call her own. The doctor was participating in the women's suffrage movement, and so invited Mabel to join her as well. And so she joined the Washington State Equal Suffrage Association, serving as headquarters secretary under Emma Smith DeVoe, who we've heard about earlier today. Rewman continued her activism in the suffrage movement when she moved to Deadwood, South Dakota, with her new husband, Paul Rewman. Once there, she became very involved in the community and different civic organizations. Her leadership was recognized in her election as president of the Deadwood Equal Suffrage League in 1917, and then again when Pyle asked her to become in charge of finances for the state organization in 1918. And Ruth had mentioned the importance of newspapers in that 1918 campaign, and Rewman is greatly credited for bringing on board the Black Hills newspapers in support of the suffrage movement, some newspapers that had kind of been holdouts in prior campaigns. And so she played a key role in those press relations. So the experiences and skill sets that these suffrage leaders brought to the 1918 campaign were invaluable, and has kind of been talked about in the campaign or the life of Mamie Shields Pyle. The 1918 campaign did face unique challenges. After the failure of the 1916 campaign, state organizers had gone back to the state legislature asking for their support for another women's suffrage amendment. This support was received, and so they were going to go forward with that campaign at about the same time that the United States entered World War I. And so this really kind of changed the whole landscape of this campaign. Initially, in fact, state suffrage leaders questioned the wisdom of continuing a suffrage campaign in the midst of wartime, knowing the demands that might be placed on people's time and energies. After significant consideration, state organizers decided that as war was being fought to keep the world, right, quote, safe for democracy, that women's suffrage was a democratic issue and that they should continue to pursue a campaign despite activity in World War I. Hipple, who was living in Pierre and working in the capital, kind of was able to forewarn Mamie Shields Pyle of some of the changes coming to her campaign. She had had a run-in with Governor Norbeck in the halls of the state capitol, and Norbeck had kind of mentioned in passing that he was thinking about calling a special legislative session because there were some kind of key things that he had wanted to talk about. That special legislative session was indeed called in March of 1918, and this is when the changes to suffrage in South Dakota were discussed and pushed forward. So again, it became known as the push for Amendment E, tying in, right, suffrage with full citizenship, kind of changing that access to what had been known as alien voting. And so with Amendment E, you know, a kind of maybe initial first review, this kind of tying of women's suffrage to full citizenship, to some felt like it would make it a much easier cause. However, as has kind of been pointing out, the wording of this amendment and its presumed support actually created a lot of headaches for the campaigners in 1918. The amendment actually became known as, quote, the garbled amendment because of its wording and the fact that it intertwined women's suffrage and alien voting instead of separating those two issues as separate measures worthy of consideration. Thus, suffragists throughout 1918 tried to come up with ways to clarify the issues for voters, spending significant time drafting all new campaign literature, posters, editorials, developing very clear campaign language, and really emphasizing that they, the suffragists, had nothing to do with the writing of this legislation. So to address both the language issue within the amendment and the fact that this was a wartime campaign, one of the strategies that the South Dakota Universal Franchise League chose was to kind of take a more patriotic approach. As you can see by this poster here from the Pyle papers, kind of connecting the suffrage movement, right, as a patriotic movement. They used themes or selected themes such as suffrage was a war measure, or calling this our citizenship amendment, again, trying to kind of maybe clear out some of the confusion about it. Ruth Hipple and Mabel Rewman, both active at kind of the state level of the Universal Franchise League, worked with other leaders to bring in what were called schools of methods, to work in cities and communities throughout South Dakota, talking about different kind of suffrage strategies. And the School of Methods advertisement is advertised here. Hipple specifically recruited to bring in a school of method to Pierre, and Rewman brought in one to Deadwood, which she stated was met with a howling success. But what was interesting, we kind of dive into what these schools of method talked about. A lot of it was new methods of organization and public relations strategies, both kind of relating to the fact that this was now a wartime measure and the way in which this amendment was written, along with kind of training women how to advocate and campaign for this specific amendment. But it wasn't just the language that made this particular campaign a challenge. With the country fully immersed in World War I, suffrage leaders were acutely aware of the time demands placed on women throughout the state. The thought that the kind of intensive campaigns of presence that had been sponsored and encouraged earlier might be too difficult at such a time. They were cognizant that many of their leaders, including Hipple and Rewman, were active in local Red Cross chapters or involved in other wartime work. Ruth Hipple, for her part, volunteered her services for the Red Cross. She eventually became the superintendent of surgical dressings and served on the Pierre chapter of the American Red Cross Executive Committee. So on top of all of her other suffrage work, she also held an office at the local Red Cross chapter. Similarly, Rewman also became involved with the Deadwood Red Cross chapter, and maybe unsurprisingly in this theme, she also served as the chapter secretary. Both women, throughout their campaigns, wrote to Pyle quite frequently, and specifically mentioned sometimes the struggles they had balancing their Red Cross work with their suffrage work, and trying to kind of meet the demands of both. Rewman mentioned in June of 1918 that she absolutely had to stop and dedicate some time to her Red Cross chapter, that she had actually been criticized by the other women of Deadwood because she had actually gone on a short tour for the 1918 suffrage campaign, and in doing so, had kind of left her Red Cross secretarial duties in the hands of someone else, and that she felt that she needed to kind of pick those responsibilities back up and focus on time in the Red Cross for a little while, meaning that she could not go out and travel in support of the suffrage amendment for a little while until the talk died down about her frequent absences. So in her letter, she writes that she's very anxious to leave and support the suffrage cause, but she had to stay and kind of focus on the Red Cross at this time. And so because of the constraints on suffrage leaders' time, right, some of the kind of other hurdles they may have been facing as they tried to divide their time between these different campaigns, or the state leadership decided, as was mentioned, to kind of have fewer local organizations, to have fewer local meetings, and actually instead encourage suffragists in communities throughout South Dakota to instead go to other civic organizations, attend their meetings, and maybe speak or present in favor of the 1918 amendment in those spaces. They were referred to as made meetings because these were already pre-scheduled, pre-organized. Suffragists just, all they had to do was show up if they were available and be a part of a Rotary Club or a Ladies' Aid Society or a Red Cross chapter meeting, right? Instead of trying to kind of plan and prepare their own event. However, this also, again, presented some unique challenges, and Rewman and Hipple both mention that while it made scheduling a little easier, there was a lot of preparatory work to go to someone else's community meeting and trying to adjust your literature and your campaign materials, your messaging for each of those specific groups, and that they had to kind of be extra cautious. Entering into just a community organization also meant that you might encounter more anti-supporters than you might have if you were doing just a kind of suffrage campaign meeting. In fact, Rewman recounted a story in which she attended a business and professional meeting where she had been invited to speak on suffrage, and a table of aunties sat and rattled their dishes throughout her whole speech for the purpose of agitation and distraction. So campaigning for suffrage during wartime and campaigning for a suffrage amendment that was presumed to have support also made fundraising for the 1918 campaign particularly difficult. Pyle actually wrote to the national organization that many men figured it would pass anyway. And so such a sentiment proved a handicap, and that no campaign could carry on its own momentum without additional funds, but no one seemed willing to give to a cause they assumed would pass. So throughout the early months of the campaign, county organizations continually failed to meet their financial commitments to the South Dakota Universal Franchise League. And by July of 1918, with Ruth Hipple serving as a signatory, the state organization had borrowed over $3,000 to help support campaign fund, the campaign trail. County organizations pointed out that it was incredibly difficult to ask for money from individuals in the community when people were also giving to war work and war efforts. And so they also pointed out that women who were doing war work didn't have the same time or capacity to fundraise as they might have in prior campaigns. It is no wonder then that when Rewman was asked to become the finance chair for the State Universal Franchise League for this 1918 campaign, that she questioned her ability to actually raise the desired amount of funds. And a lot of her initial letters to Pyle actually kind of gently try and kind of poke and see if maybe Pyle doesn't want to ask someone else, if there might not be other people who could do this better. She shared quite a bit of anxiety about stepping into a role of fundraiser at such a time in the campaign. However, despite these reservations, Rewman did have some notable success as the finance chair. Rewman herself does not give a lot of details in the records about her travels or her fundraising, but Pyle made sure to keep other suffrage supporters throughout the state updated, reporting every time Rewman hit a fundraising quota in a county, which sometimes only took mere days with her presence there. In one story, Rewman was able to get $50 from one man, which was the largest sum at that time, at that campaign, given by any one single person in Huron. And while a success in and of itself, Pyle was really pleased to note that that $50 was given by a man whose wife had actually put herself down as against suffrage. So due to Rewman's success, other women wrote to Pyle and requested that Rewman come to their city and do some fundraising campaigns in their communities. One of the things, though, was that the state organization wanted to make sure that Rewman was not in a community at the same time any war fund drive was going on. So that it was very clear that the funds were being, collected for very different purposes, and that they weren't trying to kind of collect money for different causes at the exact same time. And so organizers had to assure Pyle that no other drives were occurring when Rewman was scheduled to come to their town. Campaigning and fundraising for Amendment E hit yet another hurdle as the influenza epidemic hit South Dakota in the fall of 1918, just as suffragists were preparing for the final push before elections. This epidemic made it so that groups could not gather, travel became extremely difficult, and attention was further split as many were occupied with caring for the ill. When influenza hit communities in the Black Hills, Rewman actually tried to divert money from kind of Deadwood coffers to the city of Lead, which was particularly hard hit. She talks about the Opera House becoming a hospital for the ill, the hearse driving up and down the road, kind of creating a demoralizing kind of sense throughout the streets. And so she tried to move money to the Lead suffrage organization so that they could continue to print and distribute campaign materials as much as possible. When other communities in the hills didn't have anyone who could find the time or the space, she herself drove around the hills distributing pamphlets and leaflets to try and kind of keep up suffrage support in those final weeks before the election. So despite all of these challenges, and through the perseverance of the suffragists, Amendment E did pass in November of 1918. Both Hipple and Rewman wrote to Pyle, expressing their overwhelming emotion at this occasion, and really kind of helped put the suffrage success into context, reflecting the many hurdles the amendment had had to overcome in this final campaign. And I really like, this is actually on the exact same page from the Herald Advance out of Millbank. You can see kind of on the bottom there, the highlighted suffrage. Amendment E, women's suffrage has passed, and yet then over here you have the report of the impact of influenza in that area. And so again, kind of that the historical context of all of this is happening at the same time. And so considering the hurdles had to be overcome for the success, the perseverance that had been shown by suffragists for decades towards the suffrage amendment, I don't think anyone would blame leaders like Hipple and Rewman for wanting to rest and be a little content at this success. And instead, what we see is that they use their suffrage experience, the success that they achieved, the access to the full ballot. They now had these new political identities that they could take on to find their next causes. And I know that this is a little bit beyond the suffrage story, but there's a lot of conversation about what was the impact of the passage of women's suffrage, of the 19th Amendment, of this idea of full citizenship with full access to the ballot. And I think that the lives of Hipple and Rewman kind of show where women went next once these doors were open. And so what I thought was really interesting is that both women kind of pulled from those years of suffrage campaigning and immediately found the next campaign to join, and pulling on their networks, their communication skills, their skills as organizers and suffrage speakers. They both became very involved with the campaign for Major General Leonard Wood. He was campaigning for the Republican nomination in 1920. And they both joined together to tour South Dakota to form active Leonard Wood for President organizations from community to community, kind of harkening back to all of those suffrage organizations they helped found community by community. In doing so, like I said, they're kind of using a lot of those same strategies they had used throughout the suffrage campaigns. Outside of South Dakota, Rewman also went on a multi-state tour, speaking and campaigning throughout the Midwest for General Leonard Wood. Her efforts were so highly regarded that after the National Republican Convention, where Leonard Wood did lose to William Harding on the 10th ballot, the Republican National Committee actually asked Rewman to be one of their speakers for the fall campaign, and then she eventually became a Republican National Committee woman and served in that role for decades after suffrage. In addition to her continued political work, Rewman also took up positions on several boards. In 1918, Governor Norbeck appointed Rewman to the Women's Investigating Board on state charitable schools and institutions. And then 2 years later, he appointed her to the State Board of Charities and Corrections, making her the first woman to hold a position on one of the constitutional boards of the state. In 1929, her years of service for the Republican National Committee, her service on the South Dakota boards were recognized by President Herbert Hoover when he appointed Rewman to the Board of Labor Review, where she advised the Secretary of Labor on immigration affairs. So moved to a national board after this. Although she did not serve in the same national capacities as her friend, Ruth Hipple also pursued a variety of boards and service organizations throughout her life, really focusing herself on state and local causes. Once women had the right to vote, Hipple believed the next logical step was for women to serve on juries. And so Hipple took that campaign on, lobbying the state legislature for support. Following other suffragists at the state and national level, Hipple also became an active member of the League of Women Voters, taking on a leadership position as early as 1919. It's kind of immediately jumping from leadership in suffrage to leadership of the League of Women Voters under Pyle. To inspire and train up the next generation of leaders, Hipple also started a Girl Scout organization in her hometown of Pierre. So, in addition to their shared history of perseverance and activism, their kind of lives would intertwine in one final moment, and this is probably the one the historian in me loves the most. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, Ruth Hipple wrote the entry History of South Dakota Suffrage in 1920 for the History of Women's Suffrage, Volume 6, edited by Ida Husted Harper for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which they had been working on kind of a complete history of women's suffrage to be published. And this volume was published in 1922. And within the entry's introduction, Hipple really noted that the history she was writing came at a time when women have the same rights, privileges, and duties politically as men. And that in writing this chapter, Hipple really worried that it might sound as if suffrage happened through gradual growth and not kind of these long, hard-fought campaigns, that there was not enough space for the full and complicated history of the fight for suffrage in South Dakota. And she hoped that a more complete story that could kind of go more into detail, that could talk about the sacrifice of so many women and men who gave so much of their time, could be told. And it feels like Mabel Rewman must have felt very similarly, for she kind of took up that call. In the early 1950s, she secured the assistance of Herbert Schell, who was at the University of South Dakota. He worked to find a student who would take on the story of South Dakota women's suffrage. He found that student in Dorinda Reeson Reed, who wrote her master's thesis on the history of women's suffrage in South Dakota. He connected Rewman and Reed, and Mabel introduced her to a lot of the suffragists still living for some oral history interviews, brought out the scrapbooks and the newspaper clippings, and so Reed was able to create, quite a detailed account of the suffrage movement throughout these many decades. So these two suffragists not only dedicated years of their lives to gain access to the ballot, they also ensured that history had a record of the South Dakota suffrage movement. So experienced suffrage leaders, such as Ruth Hipple and Mabel Rewman, helped the 1918 suffrage campaign overcome significant hurdles to reach a successful conclusion. And despite how ready for arrest they may have been, they also realized new doors were opening and that their suffrage experiences served as the perfect entree into these new endeavors. So after years of campaigning to become full citizens, to have all the political rights and responsibilities that entailed, they persevered and found new and varied ways to leave an impact. Thank you.